The summer of 1565 began with a sound Europe had prayed never to hear again. The thunder of Ottoman war drums rolling across the Mediterranean. On a rocky island, barely visible on most maps, a tiny brotherhood of aging knights prepared for a storm they were never meant to survive. No reinforcements, no retreat. Just 600 men staring down an empire that had already swallowed cities, kingdoms, and entire civilizations. Before them stretched the largest invasion force the Mediterranean had witnessed since antiquity. 40,000 soldiers, siege towers taller than church spires, and cannons capable of turning stone walls into dust. Yet the Knights of Malta did not run, because they understood one truth. If Malta fell, Europe would follow.
To understand the miracle that unfolded in the summer of 1565, we must begin with the island itself, Malta, a barren rock in the center of the Mediterranean, a fortress of limestone cliffs, sun-scorched soil, and harbors so naturally defensible that ancient sailors believed the gods had shaped them for war. Malta was small, no larger than a scattered European province, and yet its importance outweighed its size. For whoever controlled Malta commanded the central Mediterranean, the sea lanes between Europe and Africa, and the routes that connected the Spanish Empire to its Italian realms. For centuries, empires had passed over this island, from Phoenicians to Romans, from Arabs to Normans, each leaving traces of their faith, their architecture, their memory. But by the mid-16th century, Malta had become the home of an order unlike any other, the Knights Hospitaller, or Knights of St. John, a brotherhood of warrior monks who had once ruled the rich lands of the Holy Land before being driven out by Mamluks, then expelled again from Rhodes by the rising Ottoman Empire. What remained of their power, their wealth, their legacy, was now concentrated on this single island, granted to them by Emperor Charles V, with the expectation that they would hold it as a shield for Christian Europe. Yet the Malta they inherited was not a paradise. The island had no rivers, no forests, no fertile plains. Its population was small, its towns modest, its economy fragile. The knights themselves number perhaps 600, an elite force of noble-born warriors trained in naval combat, siege warfare, and personal dueling, but still only 600 against the armies of the most powerful empire on earth. They compensated for their small numbers with fortifications, thick bastions, angular walls, artillery platforms that commanded the surrounding seas. But even these magnificent defenses, carved from the very rock of the island, could not conceal the fundamental truth. If the Ottomans ever returned in force, Malta would be vastly outnumbered. The Ottomans had not forgotten Rhodes. They had not forgotten the humiliation of allowing the knights to escape alive, nor the raids the knights launched upon Muslim shipping, nor the symbolic defiance represented by a Christian military order surviving in the heart of Ottoman-dominated waters. By the time Suleiman the Magnificent turned his attention toward Malta, he was no longer simply seeking to punish a nuisance. He was seeking to assert total dominion over the Mediterranean, to erase the last bastion of crusading chivalry, and to open a path for future conquests deeper into Europe. The plan was immense. An army of nearly 40,000 men would sail across the sea, supported by more than 200 ships carrying elite Janissaries, sappers, artillery, and auxiliary forces drawn from across the empire's vast territories. Their objective was simple: crush the knights, seize Malta, and turn the island into an impregnable Ottoman base from which the empire could threaten Sicily, Naples, and the vital Spanish possessions of the western Mediterranean. On the island, Grand Master Jean Perisseau de Valette, a seasoned knight in his 70s, understood that this was not merely a military confrontation, but a battle for civilization itself. If Malta fell, the balance of power in the Mediterranean would tilt decisively toward the Ottomans.
Spain, already stretched by warfare in the New World and in northern Europe, would be forced to defend Sicily and mainland Italy. Venice, whose fleets were increasingly outmatched, would face the terrifying possibility of Ottoman forces operating freely near its trade routes. And across Europe, fear of Ottoman invasion, already strong, would intensify to a level not seen since the siege of Vienna. Valet's preparations reflected this understanding. He strengthened the bastions of Birgu and Senglea. He inspected every culverin, every cannon, every supply depot. He ordered civilians to relocate behind the walls and instructed his knights to prepare for a siege that might last months. He knew reinforcements from Europe would be slow, uncertain, perhaps too late. And yet, despite the overwhelming threat, the defenders possessed something the Ottomans could not measure in numbers: a unity of purpose, born from desperation, from faith, from their shared identity as heirs to centuries of crusading struggle. They were 600 knights, but behind them were 3,000 Maltese militia, several hundred Spanish and Italian soldiers, and thousands of civilians ready to support the war effort. Together, they would form a garrison of around 9,000 souls, still hopelessly outnumbered, but determined to defend their island to the last breath. Thus, as spring warmed the Mediterranean, as sails appeared on distant horizons, and as the thunder of Ottoman cannons grew near, Malta awaited its fate. The island was small, its defenders were few, but history has shown that the smallest places often become crucibles for the greatest struggles, and that courage can shine brightest where hope is dimmest. In the coming months, Malta would become such a crucible, and the world would witness one of the most extraordinary defenses ever recorded.
When the Ottoman Armada finally appeared in early May, it must have seemed as though the horizon itself had been consumed by war. The sea was filled with ships, galleys with long sweeping oars, galleons stacked with soldiers, supply vessels carrying horses, artillery, food, and ammunition. The fleet stretched so far that observers in Birgu estimated it at more than half the distance between Malta and Sicily. Civilians fled to the fortifications, church bells rang warnings, and everywhere the same question haunted the air: how could so small an island resist so colossal an invasion? The Ottoman commanders disembarked with ruthless efficiency. Mustafa Pasha, an experienced general, assumed control of the land forces, while Piale Pasha, a brilliant naval commander, managed the fleet. Accompanying them was Turgut Reis, known in Europe as Dragut, the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean. His genius in siege warfare and naval operations had made him a legend, and his presence filled the knights with dread. Yet the Ottomans made their first strategic error even before the siege began. Disagreements among the commanders, particularly between Mustafa and Piale, led them to bypass an immediate assault on the Grand Harbor. Instead of striking directly at the knights' main strongholds, they opted first to capture Fort St. Elmo, a smaller but strategically placed outpost guarding the harbor entrance. They believed it would fall in a matter of days. In truth, it would hold for more than a month, costing the Ottomans thousands of lives and delaying their advance long enough for the knights to reorganize. The siege of St. Elmo began with a bombardment so intense that the very rock of the peninsula shook. Day after day, Ottoman cannons unleashed fire, tearing down walls, crushing parapets, and sending clouds of dust raining across the harbor. At night, the glow of flames illuminated the sea, and the screams of wounded men echoed across the water. And yet the defenders, mostly Spanish, Maltese, and a small detachment of knights, refused to break. They fought from ruined walls, rebuilt defenses under cover of darkness, and carried out desperate sorties to destroy enemy saps and trenches. The valor displayed at St. Elmo astonished even the Grand Master. Valais knew the fort could not be saved indefinitely, but every hour it held forced the Ottomans to expend precious lives and ammunition, weakening them before the main assault. The knights at St. Elmo understood this as well. They were not fighting to survive, they were fighting to delay. Dragut arrived mid-siege, enraged to find the fort still standing. He demanded intensified bombardment, and under his direction the Ottomans reshaped their trenches, repositioned artillery, and coordinated simultaneous attacks from land and sea. Walls that had stood for decades were reduced to rubble. Men fought waist-deep in debris. Cannon crews died at their guns, only to be replaced by others who stepped forward without hesitation. Finally, after weeks of relentless attack, the defenders sent a message to Valette asking permission to withdraw. Their numbers had dwindled, their weapons were failing, and the fort was nearly gone. Valette refused, not out of cruelty, but because he knew the defense of Malta depended on time that only St. Elmo could buy. He reminded them that their sacrifice would save thousands. The defenders accepted their fate with grim determination. St. Elmo fell on the 23rd of June. When the Ottomans entered the ruins, they found only a handful of survivors, all mortally wounded. The rest had died on the ramparts. The battle had lasted far longer than the Ottomans ever imagined, and the price had been catastrophic. Among the dead lay Dragut himself, struck in the head by a piece of flying stone during the bombardment. His loss would haunt the Ottomans for the rest of the campaign. As the Ottoman soldiers surveyed the ruins, exhausted, bloodied, and demoralized, they turned their eyes across the harbor towards Birgu and Senglea, the knights' main fortresses. Their victory at St. Elmo had been costly beyond measure, and now, standing high on the bastions of Birgu, watching the smoke drift across the water, the knights raised their banners and prepared for the second phase of the siege. The true battle for Malta had only just begun.
The fall of St. Elmo did not break the defenders' spirit. Instead, it hardened it. As the Ottoman cannons fell briefly silent and the last smoke drifted over the harbor, Valette used the precious days gained by St. Elmo's defenders to reinforce the walls of Birgu and Senglea. He ordered new ramparts built, trenches deepened, and platforms strengthened to hold heavier cannons. Civilians joined the effort, women carrying stones, children delivering water, old men shaping earth and timber into makeshift defenses. This was not merely a military operation, it was a communal fight for survival. Birgu and Senglea were the heart of the knights' defensive plan. Each stood on a narrow peninsula, protected by thick bastions and separated by the narrow inlet of the Grand Harbor. While the Ottomans could not cross directly from land to attack both simultaneously, they could bombard each from powerful artillery positions on Mount Siberas, the very ground where St. Elmo had fallen. The defenders knew that once the bombardment began, the walls would be tested as never before. The Ottoman cannons opened fire in July with a fury that dwarfed even the bombardment of St. Elmo. Massive stone balls, some weighing more than 100 kilograms, slammed into the fortifications, tearing away chunks of limestone and sending showers of debris into the streets. Buildings collapsed, churches crumbled, fires erupted across the town. And yet the defenders continued their work, extinguishing flames, repairing breaches, repositioning guns. Every night, Valette walked the ramparts with lantern in hand, inspecting damage, giving orders, encouraging exhausted soldiers. The greatest threat came not only from the bombardment, but from Ottoman engineers. They dug trenches and saps, inching toward the walls, protected by wooden shields and movable towers. Their sappers attempted to undermine the bastions, hoping to collapse them with gunpowder mines. The defenders countered by digging counter-mines, leading to subterranean battles fought in total darkness, where men killed each other by sound and instinct alone.
Meanwhile, Piali Pasha attempted to strike Sanglea from the sea. He loaded troops onto small vessels with the goal of landing on the unprotected side of the peninsula. But Valette had anticipated this. Using chains, floating barriers, and cleverly camouflaged gun positions, he turned the waters into a killing zone. When the Ottoman boats approached, concealed artillery opened fire, shredding the assault force and sending survivors scrambling back to safety. Still, the pressure on the defenders mounted. Ottoman infantry launched repeated assaults on the walls, climbing scaling ladders under covering fire from archers and musketeers.
The knights responded with boiling oil, flaming pitch, arquebus volleys, and close-quarters combat where swords, axes, and daggers flashed in the chaos. The battlements became slippery with blood. The air shook with the sound of war cries, gunfire, exploding artillery, and the desperate shouts of men struggling to repel yet another attack. One of the fiercest moments came at the post of the Castilian Knights, where a massive breach opened in the wall after hours of bombardment. Ottoman janissaries surged forward, confident this would be the decisive moment. But Valette himself arrived at the breach, sword in hand, rallying his men as the elite troops of the empire pressed up the rubble slope. For hours the two sides clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat until the janissaries finally withdrew, leaving the breach filled with bodies. The defenders were exhausted, but they were not defeated. Every failed Ottoman assault chipped away at their morale, their ammunition, and their supplies. Yet months into the siege, Valette's strategy was proving effective. Delay, resist, force the Ottomans to bleed slowly, steadily, until their strength faded. What the Ottomans did not know was that on the horizon, beyond their sight, a relief force was gathering in Sicily. The question was whether it would arrive in time, and whether the defenders could survive long enough to meet it.
By August, the defenders were reaching the limits of endurance. Food was running low. Water wells had been damaged. Disease spread among civilians crowded into the walled towns. The bombardment had turned Birgu and Sanglea into a landscape of ruins. Collapsed houses, shattered churches, streets filled with broken stone. The constant noise of artillery had become a grim companion, grinding down spirits with every thunderous blast. Yet the knights held firm. Their discipline, forged through decades of hardship and military tradition, kept them steady even as the odds grew worse. Still, Valette understood that the Ottomans were preparing something massive. Their trenches had reached dangerously close to the walls. Their artillery had created several new breaches. Their infantry units, though bloodied, were reorganizing for another assault. That assault came on the 7th of August in an attack that would be remembered as one of the most terrifying moments of the entire siege. Under cover of morning fog, Ottoman troops surged forward in coordinated waves. Janissaries attacked the breach in Birgu, while North African units stormed Sanglea. Artillery fire intensified, sending shockwaves through the defenses. Smoke covered the battlefield. Drums thundered. War cries echoed across the harbor. At Sanglea, the Ottomans nearly broke through. A floating bridge constructed by Piale allowed troops to cross into the heart of the town. For a moment, it seemed the defenders were collapsing, but a small group of knights, fighting with the desperation of men who had no retreat, held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. In Birgu, the janissaries tore down the defenders' makeshift barricades. They reached the streets behind the walls. Panic spread. Civilians fled deeper into the town. For a brief period, it appeared the Ottoman flag might rise over the bastions. And then something extraordinary happened.
Valette, aged 71, entered the breach himself. Wearing armor and wielding a long sword, he led a counterattack that pushed the Janissaries back step by step. His presence transformed the battle. Soldiers who had been ready to retreat returned to the fight. Civilians brought water and ammunition. Even wounded men dragged themselves to the front line. By noon, the Ottomans withdrew. Their attack had failed. Their casualties were enormous. But the defenders had reached their breaking point. They were battered, exhausted, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that still had tens of thousands of troops to throw into battle. Rumors spread that the Spanish relief force might never come. Some argued for evacuation. Others suggested surrender. But Valette refused every proposal. His answer was always the same. Malta would fight to the end, and if they fell, they would fall as warriors, not supplicants. What the defenders did not know was that in Sicily, the relief force, delayed for months by political disputes and logistical challenges, was finally preparing to sail. The question was no longer whether the aid would come, but whether Malta could endure long enough to survive until it arrived.
By early September, Ottoman morale was collapsing. Their supplies were dwindling. Heat, disease, and constant combat had worn down even the most disciplined units. The Janissaries, once the pride of the empire, now grumbled against their commanders. The auxiliary troops were exhausted and hungry, and Mustafa Pasha began to wonder whether continuing the siege was worth the cost. Then came the news the Ottomans dreaded. The Spanish relief force had landed in the north of the island. The initial Spanish contingent was small, no more than a few thousand soldiers, but their arrival changed everything. The defenders, who had been fighting for months, felt a surge of renewed hope. The Ottomans, having spent countless lives trying to break the Knights, now faced fresh European troops ready to fight. Mustafa attempted one last massive assault, focusing on Burgu. For hours, the two sides clashed. Cannon fire shook the air, muskets roared, men fought with swords, spears, and bare hands. But the defenders refused to yield. Their exhaustion had become strength, their suffering had become resolve. And with every passing hour, the Ottomans knew the end was approaching. Finally, with casualties mounted and winter nearing, Mustafa ordered a retreat. The Ottomans abandoned their camps, loaded their wounded onto ships, and sailed away, leaving behind only ruins, graves, and a devastated island that had refused to die. Malta lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed. Thousands were dead. The island's defenses were shattered. And yet, the Knights had achieved the impossible. They had survived. The victory at Malta stunned Europe. News spread across kingdoms and duchies that 600 knights and a small garrison of soldiers had defeated the mightiest empire in the world. Celebrations erupted in Rome, Madrid, Paris, and Venice. Valette became a legend. Poets, chroniclers, and diplomats praised the defenders' bravery. Churches held masses of thanksgiving. And across Europe, leaders realized that the Ottoman advance had been halted, not by vast armies, but by a small island of determined warriors. In the years that followed, Malta would be rebuilt grander than ever before. Valletta, the new fortified city, rose from the ashes of the siege, a masterpiece of military architecture designed to ensure that no enemy could ever threaten the island again. The Great Siege of 1565 entered history as a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds. It demonstrated that bravery, discipline, and unity could triumph over sheer numbers, and it preserved the balance of power in the Mediterranean for decades to come.
The Ottomans would remain a formidable empire, but never again would they attempt an invasion of Malta. The knights, though fewer in number, had proven that even the smallest of forces, when fighting for survival, could achieve greatness. Europe had been saved, Malta had endured, and the story of the 600 knights who defied an empire would echo through the centuries as one of the most extraordinary last stands in human history.